imagine with me a hillside in Eastern Europe. You see the green grass. I want you to think about the blue sky. You see the breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova. And over that hill is coming something you wouldn't expect to see. It's an older gentleman, kind of balding, suit coat, followed by a bunch of videographers and younger researchers. And next to him is standing an older gentleman, an older Eastern European gentleman. Now, this guy is named Father Patrick Dubois, and he runs an organization called Yahad in Unum. He is an example of a knowledge steward. And if you could go ahead and bring up the slides, that'd be great. He is someone who is singular in his mission. He is responsible in his mind to steward some information that is sacred and very special. He is looking for the mass graves that are all over Eastern Europe. And why are they there? It's because Hitler's henchmen, as they marched towards Russia, they stopped in every village. And most of these villages had no military value. The reason he stopped in the villages was to find the Jews. And in every village, they would dig a grave, they would shoot the Jews, and then they would cover the grave and move on. This happened all over Eastern Europe, all the way for that march. This tragic, tragic march towards Russia. And up to half of all the Jews that were massacred during the Holocaust are buried in these kinds of unmarked graves throughout Eastern Europe. No one knows that they're there. But there is this gentleman named Father Dubois, and his job, he has taken on this responsibility of stewarding the information of where these graves are. And so what does he do? He does something very simple. He goes into a village and he asks one question. He says, very simple survey, he says, who from this village was alive during the Great War, during World War II? And you know, there's 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 older men or women, and he says, can I talk with you? Will you talk with me? And he brings his team and they say, so what happened when you were young? What did you see? And he asks those questions. And when he asks those questions, they begin to hear the stories. And these stories are tragic. I mean, these stories are things that would melt your heart of young little children who saw the killing of so many people. But guess what? Those older people have been waiting for decades for Father Dubois to show up. Because, see, they had information. They didn't know what to do with it. They had information that was critical to the history of the Jewish people and the understanding for mankind of what has happened to the Jewish people. They didn't know what to do with it. They needed a steward to come and to figure out, to help them to figure out what to do with that information. Just look at some of these stats. He's visited over 1,900 execution sites. He has taken over 4,700 testimonies and taken 111 research trips. This is a guy on a mission. Think about the impact he has had on the world. Now, he's not doing this so that he can put up big monuments at each site, because, of course, there's lots of danger in doing that. He's doing this because he feels he has to steward this information. Now, why does he feel this strongly about this information? What's driving this? Well, his father was held at a Ukrainian concentration camp and witnessed some of these very things happening. And this man was so burdened by this French Catholic priest, that he has spent his life in pursuit of stewarding this information. Now, the reason he's a steward of the information is because it doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the Jewish people. It belongs to mankind. But this is a role that he is taking. And I want to challenge you today, and the thing I'm bringing to you, the idea I'm bringing to you to consider, is that each one of you is a knowledge steward. This room is full of 90-odd knowledge stewards, and you have very specific things that God has called you to steward. Not random things. These are things that God has given you at this very moment, and if you are to be obedient to Christ, you will steward them. The question is, do you know what they are? Do you know what that role means? Do you know what that looks like? But before we get into that role and what it means, what it looks like, I want to talk a little bit about information and the steward's interaction with that information. So for most of the history of the world, we really lived in an information desert, right, with a few little oases. Think about Timbuktu. Think about Alexandria. Think about Babylon. Think about China. Think about Rome. There were these places where you had rulers of great power who amassed whatever written information there was, whatever known information there was, and that information was part of their power. And there was stewardship going on there, but it was a very different kind of stewardship, right? It was the stewardship of the people who managed it on behalf of a very rich ruler who controlled it, used it as part of the way that they controlled power. So most of human history has looked like this, like a desert. But now we live in a very, very different time. Now we live in a time where information is much more like an ocean. We are drowning in it. We're surrounded by it. It's everywhere. Now, I didn't say knowledge was everywhere, but information is everywhere. Everywhere we have this stuff that we have to do something with, and that's why most of us have jobs, right? Because there's all this stuff that we got to do something with. And we have some unique problems too. So the stewards in the age of the desert, they had interesting challenges. We won't focus on those because that's in the past, but today we have some interesting challenges with information. I want to show you a few pictures. Sometimes we got to cart around a whole lot of information, and we don't have the right vehicles to do it, right? A lot of information we got to move around. Sometimes that information actually helps, it doesn't actually tips us over, right? We can't even control the amount of information we have and the cart that we're using. Sometimes we have all this information that looks the same, right? How do I tell one from the other? What's the difference? How do I know what to do with all this stuff that looks like a bunch of potatoes? Sometimes we got a bunch of little buckets with different information. We say, so what's the connection? What spice do I use with what, right? How do I use all this stuff? We have unique challenges. Sometimes we're looking one direction and the information's on the other side, right? We miss the information because we're looking in the wrong spot. It's a big ocean. Wonder what those guys felt like when they realized the whale had jumped right behind them, right? Sometimes we're so engrossed in the information that the world almost hits us in the head. See the little kid on the cell phone? Luckily, his dad reached over and got the bat, took the hit for him. Sometimes the information is out there, but it's out of reach. This picture from the Rio Olympics describes what so many feel about information. It's there, but it's not for me, right? I can't get at it, right? There's plenty of abundance. It's just not my abundance. Sometimes we know what the real information is like, but we don't have the resources to get the real deal, so we make our own, right? We cobble together our own thing. And we're struggling with all these challenges as mission information workers. This is the world we live in. And what I would like to present to you today is that the construct of a knowledge steward or knowledge stewardship is a very helpful idea to help you navigate this world that we now live in. It's an idea that will change how you view your job on a day-to-day basis and at the macro level as you engage with your beneficiaries, as you engage with your customers, as you engage with the people you're trying to serve. So let's talk about a few definitions real quick. I'm going to start with this definition of knowledge, and it's the idea that when information is organized, available, ready to be applied to situations we face in life, it then becomes knowledge. It's not yet insight, it's not yet wisdom, but at least now it is a tool in your hands that is a resource. Something can be done with it. It's not just ones and zeros anymore, it's now knowledge. And now let's think about the concept of stewardship. This is a definition of one of my friends, Dr. Kent Wilson, and I love his definition. He says, a steward is anyone who manages the property and resources belonging to another in order to achieve the owner's objectives. Now let's think about this definition. For one thing, a steward is a manager. They are managing a resource, right? Each of you is a steward. You are managing some sort of information resource. But the property and resource doesn't belong to you. It belongs to someone else. Now, in this case, obviously we could talk about our CEOs might own this information, or our boards or our constituents, but I want you to think about it from the context of God owning the information. This information doesn't belong to you. The information about our world and what God is doing in the world belongs to God. So many times we have become convinced that our information belongs to us because it's in our brain. It's really easy to think it belongs to us because it's so personal to us. But it belongs to God because God designed our brain, and God designed the process by which we got the information. And finally, it's to achieve the owner's objectives. Think about that. You are a manager managing a resource that belongs to somebody else, and you are trying to achieve the objectives of that owner. And of course, in this case, it's the kingdom. We are trying to achieve the objectives of the God of the universe as he brings his kingdom into reality in this world and comes back and rules forever. Now let's look at a definition of knowledge stewardship as a concept. So GMI, the organization I work with, is a mission that focuses on research. And we have designed our own definition of knowledge stewardship to kind of guide our work. And that is the spirit-led process of acquiring and insightfully using information for God's glory and according to his purpose. Now I want you to think for a moment. Think about what it would look like in your life if you were acquiring and using information for God's glory. It's going to look different to each one of you. That's fine. Each one of you is on your own journey, working through your own process. And so what we did at GMI was we came up with what we call our knowledge stewardship cycle. We said, so if we're knowledge stewards and we're managing this resource on behalf of our Savior, what kind of process would he want us to go through? And we designed this process saying, well, first of all, we got to have the info, right? We got to get the information. We got to know what it is. All of you have been there, surveys, due diligence, all those things. But secondly, then, we have to support the decisions that are made with that information. A steward has to say, how am I going to use that information to make a difference? But we can't even stop there. The steward's job is not yet done. Then we have to move on to kingdom-centered, outcome-based evaluation. We have to say, so what did God do as a result of my faithfulness in making that decision? And what we have found at GMI is that when a ministry or an individual does these three steps, they become a circular motion. And it leads to becoming a lifelong learner and a knowledge steward. You get information, you make a decision, you evaluate what God did with the result, then you need new information, and you start the process all over again. Think about those steps in your own life. This isn't rocket science. All of you have gone through this little process. This is fairly intuitive stuff. Now, at your tables, I want you to talk about this question. And then at the end of our time, I'll ask a few of you to come up and share some of the things you learned from the table time. What knowledge has God given you that he expects you to steward on his behalf and for his purpose? Okay, 2 minutes. Share maybe something, some piece of knowledge that God has given you that he expects you to steward. So this is something that you are supposed to steward. So go ahead, take a minute or two and share at your table. righty, let's wrap up real quick. Okay. Great. Great. All right. Thank you all for sharing. I was just listening a little bit to some of the conversations and praying for each of you as I was doing that. And it's so cool to hear the passion that people have for the information that God has put on their hearts. This is big stuff. We're not messing around. This is a real resource that God has given us, and this can have real impact, as we've heard from some of the talks this morning, how information has actually moved the dial on evangelism, on discipleship, on technology, on all these things. So now I'd like to talk to you for just a moment about 3 characteristics of a knowledge steward. The first is discernment. You have to know, what is God calling me to steward? There's a million data points, a million pieces of information, a ton of ways to think about it. Well, God, how do you want me to do that, right? It's going to be different for each one of you. There may be 3 people working on one kind of data, but taking 3 different angles. And God may have designed it really specifically that be the case, because the kingdom needs all 3 angles, right? It's not just that if, hey, one guy's got it covered or one gal's got it covered, it's all done, right? This is stuff that's complicated, and so we know that there's a lot of discernment needed. Secondly, humility. When you are working with information that does not belong to you and that is to benefit someone else, we have to check our egos at the door, and this can be really challenging. I have never seen anything quite like information to puff up a person. Because when you know something, you have power. In our world today, in the knowledge economy, knowledge is power, and we see it played on us all the time, every day. And so a knowledge steward has to be someone of great and deep humility. Third is service. A steward doesn't own the resource. You are a servant. You do not get to call the shots. But our King gets to call the shots, and he is giving you the great honor and privilege in order to be a steward in the kingdom. Think about Joseph. Now, being a servant does not mean you don't have influence. Think about Joseph in the kingdom of Egypt. He was a steward, but he was a slave, right? That's, in fact, according to Dr. Kent Wilson, most stewards in ancient times were slaves. They were a certain category of slave that were seen to have great management potential, and so were given a lot of opportunity. I want to profile one person really quick. You all know who this is up on the screen. This is Patrick Johnstone of Operation World, founder of Operation World. I've gotten to work with him over the last 4 years through Operation World and Future of the Global Church and so many projects. And he exemplifies knowledge stewardship like no one I've ever met. This is a gentleman who went to South Africa as a young man, was challenged to help mobilize people for prayer. And as he did that, he realized, wow, everyone in every country has prayer requests. They have information that they want to be prayed for their country. What if I were to gather that? What if I were to steward that information on behalf of the global church in such a way that the whole world on a certain day would be praying for a certain country? And how might that move the world? Well, we have seen just huge impact from Patrick's work, and I think he's just a great example for us to think about. But I want to notice another thing about his stewardship. We all think of Operation World when we think of Patrick, but remember that a lot of the data that began to bubble up as a result of pulling together the prayer requests began to be all this other sorts of data about percent Christian and the dynamics in the country, and some of the first research that many missionaries ever encounter is a copy of Operation World. That's the first piece of missions research they ever see. And so think about the impact of that. I just did a little diagram of some of the books that Patrick has influenced. Books for children, prayer calendars, synthesized versions. The Future of the Global Church is his whole life's work in one book. And think, he was 8 years late in delivering that. And the reason he was 8 years late is because this was so important to him. It was on his heart. He said, how am I going to best give what I've learned through my entire life to the whole church. Think about the heart behind that and his passion there. He's an amazing guy. But I wanted to give you a real example of a knowledge steward, not just keep it all theoretical. Finally, I'd like to talk, and then we're done, 5 practices of the knowledge steward. First, you have to inventory what you know. You got to know what's in the tank before you can know how far you can get. Secondly, we've got to learn from other stewards. You've got to know, how are people stewarding? What are the best practices? What does this look like in real life, not just in our ideas or in the theoretical? Third is we have to feed on Scripture. Scripture is the ultimate source of how to be a steward leader, how to be a knowledge steward. Then we have to embrace the discipline. Stewardship is a discipline. It's like prayer. It's like acts of service. It's like meditation or time alone and quiet time. This is one of the spiritual disciplines that's defined. And so this is a walk of obedience in responding to our God, right? And finally, you have to actually do it. You have to start stewarding, start managing some of this information with the mindset of a steward. So I'd like to give you 2 practical next steps. With CMIW, the Community of Mission Information Workers, we are developing an online community, a Google group, called Stewarding Knowledge for Kingdom Impact. And all of you can join. It's a place online where we're discussing knowledge stewardship. And I've got 30 copies of a book that GMI did on the theological, missiological case for mission research called Know and Go. And in it is the URL for this mission community. So the first 30 people that come up, I'd love to give you one of these and get you connected to that community. The URL is right there on the bottom of the screen. Feel free to go there and request an invite. This is going to be an awesome place. We've got over 50 people already signed up talking about elements of knowledge stewardship. It's an awesome, awesome group. And then the second thing I'd like to encourage you to do is, I just came out with a book called The Calling of the Knowledge Steward, and we have a special code for you to get 50% off this book for everyone at this conference. And it's simply a lot of what I just shared this morning, very straightforward, very easy. And it's something that will allow you to dig into the idea of knowledge stewardship just a little bit more. So I want to hear from 2 or 3 people who at your tables talked about some knowledge you're stewarding. We got just a few minutes left. Maybe 1 or 2 people that would come up and share what's an example of knowledge you're stewarding that you would like to kind of just share with the larger group, or kind of for accountability, maybe they can hold you to it later and say, how'd you end up stewarding that knowledge? What's 1 or 2 examples?
So at our table, I reflected on a visit I had with a gentleman when I was at a Finishing the Task meeting. A small mission group had connected in the central part of India and was reaching out to a people group. And he said, oh, Bible translation. I hear that there's a New Testament done in this group. I can't even remember the name of the group. And so we started talking, and I looked in our database, and I'm like, well, yes, there is. In fact, it was just completed like a couple of years ago. And we had a chance to sponsor that. So let me connect with our area director and do some research. And we found that, yes, the New Testament was done. They had a big kind of coming out party, selling it and distributing it. But then the rest were boxed up in the shed in the back of the head translator's home, private residence. So we were able to take those scriptures. We don't own them. But we were able to take those scriptures and connect them to the church planters. And so just what scriptures are done, we're going to hear a little bit about the Bible, ethnologue Bible. That's one thing that at least the Bible translation community has knowledge of that we need to steward.
Being the first one you get, Scott. All right, someone else. Don't have any more books, but anyone else? Yeah, 1 more, okay.
Do anything for a free book. Jerry Gutierrez at the back table there, just in our talking earlier, sharing about our lives, most of us have lived overseas and dealt with tribal people and oral communication and language complexities and tribal complexities. And so our life experience is kind of shown us how important it is to be able to communicate transculturally and with languages, dialects, and that we just shared, all of us, in that same kind of, our life experience has just given us so much wisdom that we're doing a practical application, which is research and languages, but our life experience that God brought us through brought us to that point.
All right, anyone else? One more. One more. All righty. Well, use this terminology and this thinking as you go through this week. Think about, what does it mean for me to be a knowledge steward? And what does it mean for me to understand what other knowledge is being stewarded in this room as we kind of move into the rest of this week? I pray that that terminology, that thinking, will be a helpful tool for you. And I'd like to wrap up with a prayer. So let's pray. We've written a special prayer for the knowledge steward. Let me pray this over each of you today. Dear God, I'm amazed at the richness of your resources. You create over and over and over. Every day, your energy is as great as before. Your insight and wisdom do not have an end. I know that you will bring about just the right resource at the right moment every time to act as a tool for bringing in your kingdom. But I know that the catalyst for that is me, not because I'm special, instead because you chose me to be a steward of your creation. You made me for this amazing task. My hands and my feet, my mouth, my ears, my mind and soul were all made for this job. But will I choose it, God? My heart is torn by the desire to own my own mind, body, and soul. I daily believe this lie and lose out on the blessings of taking my true place. Bring me back in line. Adjust my priorities to your will. Make me a humble, discerning, servant-hearted steward today. Take every selfish thought captive and replace them with yours, with your thoughts, O God. Then release me to bring wisdom and insight to your world. Amen.